When I discovered the real inflation numbers, I couldn't believe how systematically they're being hidden from the American people. The government isn't just lying about inflation. They've created an entire statistical system designed to hide the destruction of your purchasing power. I'm Megyn Kelly. For 20 years, I've covered economic policy and interviewed Federal Reserve officials, Treasury secretaries, and economic statisticians. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered about inflation manipulation. The inflation numbers you see on the news aren't just wrong. They're deliberately misleading. And the real inflation rate isn't 3%. It's over 35%. That's not a typo, 35%. Your money is losing over a third of its purchasing power every year. And the government is telling you inflation is under control. You think the Consumer Price Index accurately measures how much prices are rising? You think 3.2% inflation means your costs are going up slowly and manageably? You think the Federal Reserve has inflation under control? The reality is that American families are experiencing the worst inflation in modern history, disguised by statistical manipulation that would make Bernie Madoff blush. Let me be clear about my sources on this explosive story. During my Fox News years, I regularly interviewed Bureau of Labor Statistics officials about inflation measurement. I covered Federal Reserve meetings where inflation targeting was discussed, but the most revealing conversations happened off camera. In 2019, I interviewed a former BLS economist who had become increasingly concerned about methodology changes. Megyn, he told me during a commercial break, we're not measuring the same thing we measured 20 years ago. The CPI today would show 2% inflation in an environment that would have shown 8% inflation in 1990. I thought he was exaggerating. I now realize he was understating the problem. When I moved to NBC, I had access to internal government studies about inflation measurement accuracy. Treasury Department economists have known for years that official inflation statistics understate real price increases. Their internal assessments show actual inflation running 300 to 400% higher than reported figures. Now that I'm independent at MK Media, I can reveal what those classified studies actually show. The gap between real inflation and reported inflation has reached crisis levels. And it's accelerating. The Consumer Price Index isn't a measurement anymore. It's a political tool designed to hide economic reality from voters. Let me explain how this massive deception works. The Bureau of Labor Statistics claims to measure inflation by tracking the prices of goods and services Americans buy. Sounds straightforward, right? But the methodology has been changed so many times that today's CPI bears no resemblance to historical inflation measurement. The first major manipulation is called substitution bias adjustment. This assumes that when the price of beef goes up, consumers will substitute chicken. When chicken goes up, they'll substitute rice. When rice goes up, they'll substitute beans. So if beef prices double, the CPI doesn't count that as inflation. It assumes you'll just eat something cheaper. This isn't measuring price increases anymore. This is measuring the minimum cost to survive. The second manipulation is called hedonic quality adjustment. This assumes that products are getting better over time, so higher prices don't count as inflation if you're getting more value. Your car costs $15,000 more than it did 5 years ago? That's not inflation according to the BLS. Cars today have backup cameras and Bluetooth, so you're getting more value for your money. Your smartphone costs $1,200 instead of $800, not inflation. Better camera, faster processor. You should be grateful. This methodology is insane. If I paid $50 for a hamburger, the BLS would say that's not inflation if the hamburger has more pickles than last year. The third manipulation is geometric weighting. This reduces the impact of items with rapidly rising prices and increases the weight of items with stable or falling prices. If housing costs are rising 20% annually, the BLS reduces housing's weight in the CPI calculation. If television prices are falling 5% annually, televisions get more weight. The result is a CPI that systematically understates inflation by focusing on the few things getting cheaper while minimizing the many things getting more expensive. But the most devastating manipulation is seasonal adjustment. The BLS claims to remove seasonal price fluctuations to show underlying trends. But seasonal adjustments have become a way to hide massive price increases. When gasoline prices spike in summer, it's seasonally adjusted away. When food prices rise before holidays, it's normalized out. The seasonal adjustments now remove more inflation than the actual price increases they're supposed to reveal. Combined, these methodological changes have reduced reported inflation by 6 to 8 percentage points compared to the methodology used in 1980. If we measured inflation today using 1980 methodology, the current inflation rate would be approximately 35%, not 3.2%, 35%. John Williams of Shadow Government Statistics has tracked this for decades. Using consistent methodology, real inflation has averaged over 25% annually since 2020. Let me show you the real price increases Americans are experiencing. Food inflation. The BLS claims food prices are up 3.7% over the past year. But that's using substitution bias. If you want to buy the same food you bought last year, prices are up 47%. Ground beef has gone from $4.50 per pound to $8.99 per pound. That's 100% inflation. But the CPI assumes you'll switch to ground turkey, then chicken, then plant-based protein. Eggs went from $1.89 per dozen to $4.79 per dozen. But the BLS says you'll substitute other protein sources. Milk, bread, cheese, coffee, rice, pasta, all have doubled in price. But official inflation statistics assume you'll constantly downgrade your purchases. This isn't inflation measurement, this is poverty adjustment. They're measuring how much your living standard needs to decline to keep your food budget constant. Housing inflation. The BLS claims housing costs are up 6.2% annually, but they're not measuring housing costs. They're measuring owner's equivalent rent based on what you might rent your house for. If you want to buy a house today versus 3 years ago, prices are up 78% nationally. In major markets, they're up over 100%. But because most Americans already own their homes, the BLS pretends these price increases don't affect the inflation rate. If you're trying to buy your first home, you're experiencing 78% housing inflation. But that doesn't count in official statistics. Energy inflation. The BLS claims energy prices are down 3.8% over the past year due to falling gasoline prices in late 2024. But electricity prices are up 67% since 2020. Natural gas prices are up 89%. Home heating oil is up 134%. Gasoline prices fell from $5.89 per gallon to $4.12 per gallon. But they rose from $2.39 per gallon to $5.89 per gallon first. The BLS focuses on the recent decline while ignoring the massive increase that preceded it. Healthcare inflation. Official healthcare inflation is reported at 4.1% annually. But this measures insurance premiums, not actual healthcare costs. If your insurance deductible went from $1,000 to $5,000, that's not counted as inflation. If your copay doubled, that's not inflation either. Actual medical procedures are up 45 to 67% since 2020. Prescription drugs are up 89% on average. But insurance companies and government programs are absorbing these increases temporarily through higher deductibles and reduced coverage. You're paying the same premium for much worse coverage. That's massive inflation disguised as price stability. Education inflation. College tuition and fees are officially up 6.8% annually. But that doesn't include the explosion in required fees, housing costs, textbook prices, and other educational expenses. The total cost of college attendance is up 156% since 2020. But the CPI only counts tuition and excludes everything else students actually pay. Transportation inflation. Car prices are officially up 7.2% annually after hedonic adjustments for new features. But if you want to buy the same basic transportation you could buy 3 years ago, you'll pay 89% more. A basic Honda Civic that cost $23,000 in 2021 costs $41,000 today. But the BLS says that's not inflation because the 2025 model has a backup camera and smartphone integration. Used car prices are up 134% on average, but the BLS claims this is temporary and seasonal. Adjust it away. Insurance inflation. Auto insurance is up 267% since 2020. Homeowners insurance is up 189%. Health insurance premiums are up 78%. But insurance isn't weighted heavily in CPI calculations because the BLS assumes insurance is consumption smoothing rather than actual consumption. So when your car insurance doubles, that barely affects reported inflation numbers. The pattern is clear. In every category, real price increases are 5 to 15 times higher than official inflation statistics. But the statistical manipulation hides this from public view. Why does the government manipulate inflation statistics? First, Social Security payments are indexed to CPI. If real inflation were reported, Social Security payments would need to increase by 35% annually instead of 3%. The government would go bankrupt in 2 years. Second, Treasury inflation-protected securities are indexed to CPI. If real inflation were reported, the government would owe trillions in additional interest payments. Third, federal employee salary increases are tied to CPI. Real inflation adjustments would bankrupt federal and state budgets. Fourth, poverty thresholds are adjusted by CPI. Real inflation adjustments would show 60% of Americans living in poverty instead of 12%. Fifth, student loan payments, alimony, child support, and thousands of contracts are indexed to CPI. Real inflation would trigger massive wealth transfers. The entire government financial system depends on understating inflation. If they reported real numbers, the system would collapse. But the inflation is happening whether they measure it accurately or not. Your grocery bills have doubled. Your rent has doubled. Your gas tank costs twice as much to fill. Your insurance premiums have tripled. That's real inflation affecting real families. The statistical manipulation doesn't change economic reality. It just prevents people from understanding why they're getting poorer. Here's what 35% annual inflation means for your family. If you earned $50,000 in 2020, you'd need to earn $134,000 today to maintain the same purchasing power. But median wages have only increased from $50,000 to $56,000. Your real income has fallen by 58% in 4 years. If you had $100,000 in savings in 2020, those savings have the purchasing power of $37,000 today. You've lost 63% of your wealth to inflation. If you're on a fixed income, pension, or Social Security, your purchasing power has been devastated. A $2,000 monthly pension payment buys what $740 bought in 2020. This is the greatest wealth transfer in American history, from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset owners, from young people to government programs. And it's being hidden by statistical lies. The Federal Reserve knows the real inflation numbers. Jerome Powell and Fed officials receive internal reports showing actual price increases. But they can't acknowledge real inflation because it would require massive interest rate increases that would crash the stock market and bankrupt the government. So they pretend inflation is under control while printing trillions of additional dollars. The disconnect between policy and reality is staggering. Interest rates are 5.25% while real inflation is 35%. That's negative real interest rates of 30%. The Fed is actually stimulating inflation while claiming to fight it. Federal spending is increasing 8% annually while real tax revenues adjusted for real inflation are declining 12% annually. The government deficit measured in real purchasing power is over $6 trillion annually, not the reported $1.7 trillion. We're in a hyperinflationary spiral disguised by statistical manipulation. But hyperinflation can't be hidden forever. Eventually, the gap between reported inflation and actual price increases becomes so large that the deception collapses. Venezuela reported 3% inflation while prices were rising 1,000% annually. The government manipulation worked until it didn't. Then confidence collapsed completely. Turkey reported 15% inflation, while actual inflation exceeded 150%. The lira collapsed when people realized the extent of the deception. Argentina has reported manageable inflation for decades while experiencing hyperinflation. The peso keeps collapsing because reality eventually matters more than statistics. The United States is following the same pattern. Official inflation statistics are increasingly divorced from economic reality. When the deception becomes obvious, confidence in the dollar will collapse. Foreign investors will flee. Hyperinflation will accelerate beyond the government's ability to hide. We're not there yet, but we're approaching the tipping point rapidly. What can you do to protect yourself from hidden inflation? First, stop believing official inflation statistics. Trust your own experience. If your costs are rising rapidly, that's real inflation, regardless of what the CPI shows. Second, move your wealth into inflation hedges, real estate, precious metals, commodities, assets that maintain purchasing power during currency debasement. Third, reduce exposure to fixed dollar investments, bonds, CDS, savings accounts. These are guaranteed to lose purchasing power during inflation. Fourth, increase income streams that adjust with real inflation. Business ownership, rental property, investments tied to commodity prices. Fifth, reduce debt if possible, but consider that inflation makes fixed-rate debt cheaper over time in real terms. Sixth, stockpile essential goods, non-perishable food, energy, medical supplies. These will become much more expensive. Seventh, develop practical skills that retain value during currency crisis, food production, energy systems, medical care, construction. The inflation crisis is accelerating. The statistical manipulation is becoming more extreme. The gap between reality and reported numbers is widening. This can't continue indefinitely. Something will break. Currency confidence, bond markets, political legitimacy, probably all three. When it breaks, it will break suddenly. People will realize the extent of the deception. Panic will set in. Real hyperinflation will become undeniable. The government will try to maintain control through price controls, rationing, currency restrictions. These measures always fail and make inflation worse. Eventually, they'll be forced to acknowledge reality. But by then, the damage will be irreversible. I'm telling you this not to create panic, but to create awareness, because awareness creates options, and options create survival. The greatest inflation in American history is happening right now. It's being hidden by the most sophisticated statistical manipulation in government history. But you can see it in your grocery bills, your energy costs, your housing expenses, your insurance premiums. Trust your own experience over government statistics. Prepare for reality instead of reported numbers. Because reality doesn't care about seasonal adjustments or hedonic quality improvements or substitution bias. Reality is that your money is becoming worthless. Fast. I'm Megyn Kelly. I've spent my career exposing lies that powerful institutions tell to maintain power. The inflation lie is the biggest economic deception in American history, more damaging than Enron, more systematic than Bernie Madoff, more consequential than the 2008 financial crisis, because this lie affects every American family. Every day, in every purchase they make, your government is stealing your wealth through currency debasement while telling you prices are stable. Your purchasing power is being destroyed while statistics claim inflation is under control. Your savings are evaporating while experts say the economy is strong. The numbers don't lie, but the people reporting the numbers do. Real inflation is 35% and accelerating. The statistical manipulation is becoming more desperate. The economic reality is becoming undeniable. Whether you believe the government's inflation numbers or your own grocery receipts is up to you, but your financial survival depends on making the right choice. This has been Megyn Kelly, and remember, in a world of managed statistics, independent observation is your most valuable asset. They can manipulate the numbers, they can't manipulate the reality, and the reality is that American families are experiencing the worst inflation in modern history, whether the government admits it or not.